You ready to speak? We are talking about the precious Church of Christ, the bride of Christ, and we are thankful for the marvelous privilege it's ours to be a member of the Church of Christ. And so it's always good for us to study about the church. Now, I believe that it's important that in our sermons and in our Bible classes, we have variety in our teaching. This book's a thick book. There's a lot to study. But we always need classes, we always need sermons regarding the church of our Lord. It is so very much a vital part of His teaching in the New Testament. Jesus promising to build His church, Matthew 16:18. We find that the church came into being. It was established in Jerusalem, according to Acts 2nd chapter. So we've been looking at the church for some time, considering what makes a great congregation of the Lord's people. For example, we've already talked about the purpose of the church, and some time ago we also considered the organization of the church, its autonomy. We talked about the elders who oversee the work. We talked about the role of evangelists. And we've also spent some time talking about the church and its worship, the church and the love that she is to share with one another and with those in our community, a Christ-like love. As we continue to reflect on this idea of worship, tonight I want to get into something a little more practical, because before we went into the holidays and took a break from classes, we were talking about the church and the scriptural acts of worship. And by scriptural acts of worship, we are simply stating that there are passages of Scripture that tell us what the first century church did when they came together. And whatever it is they were authorized to do, then we're authorized to do that today. And so tonight we want to look at some practical aspects of what can help us, what can enhance our worship, what encourages worship in spirit and in truth. And that's the only kind of worship that is satisfying to the Father, worship that is in accordance with truth and spirit and in truth, John 4:24. So I want to have the right attitude. I know you do as well. Now, I have known some individuals who have, because of poor health, been unable to get out of the house to do very much. Some of these individuals are on up in years, and they cannot go out to eat with others. They cannot go shopping. They cannot really make any visits anymore. At one time, they were very, very active members of the church, but because of poor health, because of limitations placed on them, because of age, they just don't get out anymore unless they can muster enough strength to get to the morning assembly on the first day of the week. And I respect that. I know you do. Now, faithful children of God want to be at every assembly. Some people, because of age and poor health, cannot make it to any assemblies. We sometimes call them the homebound. But I've known a few who could only make it to a morning worship service. Now, I can recall while living in Fayette, Alabama, I don't know if April ever remembers Miss Willie Larry Stewart, but Miss Willie Larry Stewart has been dead a number of years, and when April was just a child, Miss Willie Larry probably passed away. But I can remember her. She was legally blind, and someone would bring her to service on the first day of the week. And there were times when she would try to get out during the week, but it was rare. And there was a time or two when she would say, if you will come by and pick me up, I'm going to take you and your wife to lunch. And so we'd go to Charles's cafeteria, downtown Fayette, I always remember Sister Whittlary Stewart would get a piece of chicken or whatever, some kind of meat, and a vegetable, and a piece of pie. And she'd play around with her vegetables, didn't eat much of that. She'd wrap up her chicken to take home and eat every bite of her pie. But I mention her because she would also say this to me. She says, Brother Crowder, you know those tracts we have down there at the church on the, down at the church building that have to do with some particular doctrinal subject, and she would mention it, or it just might be an introduction to the Church of Christ. She said, bring some of those to me, because she says, there's a lady who stops by who's not a member of the church, and she's the sweetest lady, and said she cleans the house for me, looks after me some. I'd like to give her one of those tracts. So here's a woman who still tried to be evangelistic to the extent that she could, and the one appointment she had that she always tried to keep was the worship assembly. And of course, we've often heard about those who are in foreign places where it's very difficult to worship. You remember what Brother Bland was talking about this past Sunday with regard to the policies in China. And we would know that would be true in a lot of Muslim countries. By the way, there's a lot right now that's happening internally in Iran that could turn out for good. And it's going to take a lot of courage on behalf of the Iranian people to stand up to this Islamic government that's been in power since 1979. You remember the Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic revolution that ran out the Shah. And now there's, it seems to be maybe another revolution that's going on in Iran. And I hope it happens. Anything that might be done that might bring some peace, and not just peace, but some relief to those people who are in Iran, that would be a good thing. And then, of course, we always pray that things will change so that we can take the gospel into countries like Iran. But there are people in these countries who still worship, even under duress. Sometimes they have to worship in secret. And the point I'm making is that we are a people who are blessed because we have the privilege to worship. In the summertime, it's air conditioned. Tonight, it's warm, maybe not enough for some of you, but we know it's warmer than it is outside. And so we want to give thanks unto God, having hearts filled with gratitude, to be able to assemble as we have this evening and when we assemble on the Lord today. So we know the scriptural acts of worship. We want to engage in those scriptural acts of worship. But let's be careful that we don't ever take the privilege of worship for granted. And especially I say this to those of us who are men, the brethren. Let's take advantage of opportunities we have to lead in the public assembly. That's one reason I'm looking forward to the class that I'm going to begin teaching on Sunday morning for men on leadership training. Now, I remember what it was like to be a teenager. I became a Christian when I was 13 and very anxious to be faithful in every way. But there were those moments, you know, a year or 2, 3 years after becoming a Christian. I didn't ever forsake the assembly. I wasn't allowed to, didn't want to. But I do remember this. I'd always think, you know, well, being a small congregation, I'm going to have to wait on the table again today. Can't they get somebody else? I'd like to go without having to lead a prayer. But it seems like every time I go, they grab me to do something. And then my mother would say, let me tell you, she said, if I was a man, it would be an honor and a privilege to stand there and lead a prayer or to serve at the Lord's Supper table. Well, yeah, right, you're a woman. You're not doing that. You know, if you knew, well, she was right. It is an honor and it is a privilege, and I have counted such ever since. And so we want to talk tonight about some attitudes that will help us as it relates to worship. Now, I want to do things in a scriptural way. You do too. That's how we've been taught, and that's what's right. I want to be able to say that whatever it is that I do in worship has the authority of heaven behind me, don't you? And sometimes we get into discussions with our religious friends because of what they may do in worship. And they may talk about some of the things they do in worship, and we counter that with what we do in worship. And sometimes we might ask some good questions. For example, well, why do you not partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? And they may respond in different ways. But we know we have what? The Scriptures behind us. And when you're asked, well, you know, why do you all not use mechanical instruments of music in worship? That's rather strange. You just ask the question, well, why do you use them? Why do you use them? Nothing in the New Testament about such. So you need to tell me why it is you use them. And so we always want to be polite, friendly in our conversations if they will allow us to be friendly in our conversations. But we do want to be bold, don't we? And we want to be clear about what the Bible teaches. Now, all that's well and good. But as I've said before, can one come into an assembly and go through those scriptural acts and still not worship? Yeah, it can happen. Brother Winkler used to say so often, the heart of the matter is still the matter of the heart, isn't it? And, you know, he also would say, you could do some things right and still be wrong. You know, if you don't have the right attitude. And so when I think about worship, I'm reminded that it's going to take the proper attitude. It's going to take some discipline on my part, on your part. Discipline plays such a key role in success. And I want God to accept my worship, and I want to worship it. And I already know from such passages as John 4:23, He delights in that worship. And I know from so many passages He's worthy of my worship. I'm amazed that He will accept my worship. And if I know that He will accept my worship, therefore I want to worship correctly. And so for just a few minutes this evening, let's think about worshiping God with a good attitude. And what can we do in our assemblies to enhance that? In fact, is there anything we can do before we come to worship that will help us in the worship? I think that there are some things that can help us as we plan for. You know, we plan for other things. Do you plan to worship? Do you plan for it? Do you get your heart and your mind ready for worship? Now, it could be that a person understands that, hey, there are scriptural acts of worship, and therefore, I want to worship in truth, and that's to be commended. Somebody else may not care that much what God authorizes in worship, but indeed comes in with an attitude that says, oh, I'm ready to worship my God. All right? There's a happy medium here. We need to have hearts that desire scriptural worship with a heart that is longing to praise and to give everything from within to the Lord. As a matter of fact, we think about our praise. We praise with the tongue, but we're not just mouthing words, we're thinking about what we're singing, right? When it comes to the song service, for example. We're using our minds to think about Jesus and His death when we partake of the Lord's Supper. That's why I say discipline is so very important, discipline of the mind. And so we have a purpose when we come together in the assembly. We don't want to waste our time, and we don't want to be flippant in attitude when you consider that worship is being presented to a holy God, and one who is worthy of worship, and one who is to be reverenced. And so we want to keep that in mind. Now, I have known some individuals before who I know, if you said something to those individuals that we've decided that we're going to have some type of instrument, mechanical instrument in the worship, that they would say, no, we're not going to do that, that's wrong. And I believe it is too. But those same people might sit in an assembly during the song service and not open their mouths when they sing. Is that wrong? That's wrong too. If anyone here is guilty of the sin of not singing, I want to encourage you to change that, because we're commanded to sing. And so there's no difference in somebody coming along saying, you know, well, I don't believe, we ought to have instruments, and yet this same person who says we ought only to sing doesn't even open his mouth. And somebody who says we need to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, which the early Christians did. They're right when they defend that truth, but then do not even concentrate on what's taking place during that particular time? Well, I think about preparing our hearts, having the right attitude in worship means that I've got to do some preparing beforehand, right? I've got to do some preparing beforehand. Now, obviously, we want to live Christian lives all through the week. You've heard it said many times by preachers a long time ago, preachers more contemporary, that you can't live for the devil 6 days a week and come worship on Sunday, right? So our worship, if we're going to offer it to God in the right way, Christianity is a way of life, isn't it? And so I need to be prepared to worship God. And so I've got to think about heart preparation before I enter into the assembly to worship. Now, there are some things that need to happen on a Saturday that will allow us to be in a proper position to worship on Sunday. I find it very difficult to think that a person can just hang out somewhere on a Saturday night all night without any rest whatsoever. I'm not saying the person engaged in anything wrong, but then be ready to worship on the Lord's Day morning. It seemed to me that if we're really serious about worship, then we need to think Saturday night about making sure we get enough rest, making sure that that we are prepared to engage in the worship. I have an advantage over some of you because I know what the program says before you get here. I know that by the middle of the week to the latter part of the week, and I'm already singing the hymns that we're going to sing in worship just to myself before I get here on Sunday morning. But preparation begins on Saturday night. I'm not talking about the preparation of the heart. That's ongoing. I'm just talking about time to start thinking about worship. Surely is the day before. What I mean by that is you don't want to sleep as late as you can on Sunday morning with no idea what you're going to wear, no idea what you're going to eat before, and you run out of the house in a haphazard way and you're going to try to worship acceptably. It's going to be very, very difficult to do that.
Have you been to my house lately?
I could tell that story on you, but I love the story about Mark, and we've all been, can I tell the story? Anyway, we've all been in this situation, but I love when Brother Mosier tells the story, and I guess I've heard Mark and Karen and them tell it as well. And I tell it because I know from experience that the same things happen to us. But Brother Mosier said they were all having one of those mornings where nothing's going right, and they're all getting upset with one another, and they're in the car still fussing, and you're on your way to the service, and said as soon as he opened the door, there's a sweet sister there, and Brother Mosier said, "Good morning, sister, how are you doing?" And what was it, Keith that said, or Mark?
I turned around and told the children,
yeah,
we're all going to get a whipping when I got home.
Yeah,
and when I turned around, she was standing there, and she said something, and I said, "Good morning." And Mark yelled, "Daddy's a hypocrite!"
Yeah, Daddy's a hypocrite. Oh, they let us have it, you know. Better be careful around your children, right? I'll tell you. Well, when Gary Bradley was preaching a meeting for our congregation when I was just a boy, I remember that Brother Bradley told the most interesting story about sitting watching Hee Haw one night with his wife. Now, how many of you remember Hee Haw? Yeah, sure. And so he's watching Hee Haw and said, she all of a sudden said, every time I see Roy Acuff, she said, I think of shoe polish. And he said, I turned around to her and I said, well, what are you talking about? Every time you see Roy Acuff, you think of shoe polish. She said, yeah, I think of shoe polish. And he said, well, would you like to explain that to me? She said, sure, I'll be glad to. She said, it gets me back to my childhood. Listening to WSM Grand Ole Opry on Saturday night, and we're shining and polishing in our shoes, getting ready for Sunday morning. He says, I think about shoe polish when I see Roy Acuff. All right? So preparation. What about in the mornings? Sunday morning, you say, well, I'm going to sleep as late as possible. I understand the importance of sleep, but it might be good to get up a little bit earlier and just have a moment with Bible or your Bible class lesson, time alone to pray, just to get your heart right, to get your focus where it needs to be as you're about to worship God on that morning. I have always said that it's good, especially in a family, good size, where there's mom, dad, and the kids, to know what you're going to wear the next morning, to know whether or not you got what you need. That's what happens a lot of times at our house is I have these two teenage girls who haven't done that. And then, we've told them, make sure you have everything ready on Saturday night. And yet they're not ready when the next morning something they wanted to wear, they don't have it. And so I look in the rearview mirror on the way to service, they're all gloomy, And so Jason and I, we feel good, don't we? But they say, it's not as difficult for you. Well, then you ought to have done that the night before. Well, those are some things we can do. Eat you something, If you don't eat before you go to the assembly, then you're going to be thinking about where you're going to go to lunch, right? And you're going to be more focused on your stomach than you are on worshiping God. These are just practical matters that I'm telling you affect how we worship, all right? So we want to be mindful of that. But we get to an assembly, and here we are ready to assemble together. It's, we come before worship, we get here before Bible class, and we want to get here in time where we can meet and greet our brethren, all right? We're not trying to slip in if we can prevent it. Just as a service begins, and then just as soon as amen is said, we get out. Well, that means some spiritual inventory right there. And so I do think there are some people, and I realize there are those who maybe have personalities that not as outgoing, maybe more introverted, whatever. But I do believe that some individuals want to be in a place where they're barely noticed at all. Okay? And therefore they get in, get out, and nobody pay attention. But the church of our Lord is a community of believers. And there's fellowship there that involves more than just worshiping together. And so when we come into the assembly, put on your happy face. And, some people can't come to service because they go, well, I'm just suffering through a period of distress and a period of depression. I don't mock that. But are you telling me by sitting at home that helps it? I don't think it does. And I think what a wonderful place when we can be here in the assembly for just that short time during the week where we can let go of what's happening on the outside. Haven't we heard that stated in prayer? Lord, help us that we may remove the thoughts and the cares of this world and just focus upon Thee. Well, we come together, I would pray, with a good attitude, glad to see each other. And so I'm concerned, you're concerned about what's happening in the lives of others, but that doesn't mean as soon as we see each other upon the first day of the week, we need to give the history of the week about everything that's gone wrong with us, right? We have to do that. Now, glad to see each other. And glad to assemble. Now let's think for just a moment about what the leader can do in this assembly and what those of us who are seated in the pews can do. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about in this leadership training for men will be as simple as how to make announcements. I mean, there's a way to make announcements? Yes. Well, where is that? Not in the New Testament, except we're told to do what we do in an orderly manner. And so announcements, for example, are not an act of worship, but they can be included in the worship. And why is that? Because it has to do with the affairs of a local congregation. And churches of Christ in the first century came together and were interested in the affairs of the congregation. And reports were made about what's going on, not just in the congregation where we are members, but elsewhere. What did Brother Bland do this past Sunday but come and inform us about works in which we are involved and supporting in other places in the world. Did you know there have been brethren of the past who say, you can't do that unless you have it in the worship service and all too. That's not worship. Listen, the church can come together in an assembly like that just to hear what? A report on the work of the church. Now, we incorporate various acts of worship when we do that. But we're talking now about the Lord's Day assembly. We know the scriptural acts that are involved. But making announcements, a necessary part of the functioning of the church. Because what will be said if we don't make it? I didn't hear that. I didn't know that. I'll pick on our students here. They're good students. These are the cream of the crops in my class, by the way, on Wednesday night. So I'm not going to dig at them. But anyway, they'll get a good grade. No doubt about it. But let's think about this. Sometimes I'll ask the students, we didn't see you at such a particular day. Well, we didn't know anything about it. You don't read your bulletin then. You're supposed to read your bulletin. And what if the members of the church where you preach are like you and don't pay attention to the bulletin and what's going on? You've got to pay attention to the bulletin. That's one way you get announcements out there. One way you get announcements is on the screen. To make sure everything is covered, then one of the elders will make some announcements. Now, one thing that's very, very important about one who makes the announcements or welcomes everybody on a Sunday morning is that person what? Be warm and friendly. And if a person doesn't have the capacity of doing that, that's probably not his work. That's probably not what he's cut out to do. I still remember the preacher that back home, I loved him. He very much encouraged me to become a preacher. And I knew him, and my family knew him, and he was from our area, and he lived there all of his life. And his daddy was a gospel preacher before him, and this particular work that he did in addition to his having a secular job. But I know he was a happy man because I've been around him private. But he never looked that way. He had a scowl on his face all the time. And he'd stand in the pulpit and he'll say, now I'll tell you what, we need to remember we're Christians and we need to put a smile on our face. Well, I think he meant that, you know. He just didn't know how to do it. His face just didn't work that way, you know. His smile was a scowl, but I appreciate the sentiment that he expressed. What about song leading? Song leading obviously is not for everybody. Not for everybody. That reminds me of talking about Roy Acuff, one of my fathers in the faith, along with Brother Mosier, Brother Larry Acuff. He's a preacher's preacher. And I call Brother Larry regularly. Be praying for him, by the way. He's undergoing some treatments for cancer, and so is Janet, his wife. Larry Acuff. Oh, Larry. And he's coming along okay. But Larry Acuff was related to Roy. They were cousins. And so probably second or third because Roy had been a lot older than Larry. But Larry tells the story of going to one congregation where a woman said, are you kin to Roy Acuff? And he said, yes. He said, I'm kin to Roy Acuff. He said, but I can't sing. She said, the old lady said, well, Roy couldn't either, but it never did stop him. Then he went on. So, not everybody can lead sing. I realize that. Now, I will say this. Let's always be careful not to criticize too harshly those who lead sing. I've known some who tried to lead because nobody else would, and then that fellow trying would be criticized by those who wouldn't try. Well, if you're not going to try to do something, then don't be critical of it. But obviously, when we sing, we need a song leader who enthusiastically leads. And not only that, we need to sing songs that are appropriate. I'm going to try to encourage more song leaders in this class that's upcoming. And because we need to have song leaders who are men who may not have a degree in music, but have some experience in leading a congregation. Now, there are moments when we give some people an opportunity to try, like these young people, right? And they may not always start it on the right key, but that's all right. We just say, bless your heart, you did a good job, you could, right? Keep trying, don't give up yet. And we can endure that for the moment. And, but you know, we like, in our regular assembly, we like to have somebody who's a good, strong voice, who can lead sing and lead appropriate songs, right? Appropriate songs. Helen?
And for us old people,
yeah.
We lead an old song sometimes.
Lead an old song. Seems like we lead a whole lot more old than we do new. Helen says no. Maybe somewhere in between. I think that's important, though. I think both's important. I have never been part of this idea that, which is prevalent in many congregations, just sing contemporary song choruses and nobody knows. Or maybe just a younger group knows. On the other hand, I'm always open to learning new songs. I will say this, isn't there a time when we probably could learn some songs, like in a singing or something like that, and sing songs that are like the older songs, some that are more familiar to us. So we have the obligation now to learn new songs, all right? And I'll tell you one way to learn new songs is just get your songbook out and learn them. And if I look at a songbook during the week and I don't know the song, I'll just YouTube it and learn how to sing it, and then I've got it. You know, well, I can't carry it to you. Well, a little more difficult for you then. But we want a song leader to sing enthusiastically and to sing appropriate songs. Now, let me just give you an idea of what I'm talking about, why this is important. I have been out to preach in some places, like some of our boys go out and preach. And listen, I believe whether it's a small little country church or a congregation of 500, that we need to approach God reverently. And worship's important, regardless. Now, I know that I have gone to congregations before where I know that the song leader did not put any time at all into the selection of the hymns. None. I know that because, for example, in the when it's Sunday morning at 10:30, the song leader would lead "Day is Dying in the West" for the opening song, right? It's Sunday morning. I mean, somewhere in the world, I guess day is dying in the West, but not here with us, all right? It's Sunday morning. I've just extended the invitation in a gospel meeting. I want people to come. He gets up and sings, "Oh, why not tonight?" No, I don't want him to wait till tonight. I want him to come right now, okay? Or how about this? You go to hold a gospel meeting, and I mean, everybody seems to have the right attitude. Everybody's happy. Time for the gospel meeting to begin. You go to some of these small towns and rural areas, I mean, that's the highlight of the year for that church is the gospel meeting. And so they shall sometimes tell me when I talk about all the food, so just tell them ahead of time that you don't want that big meal. They don't have to. I said, that's what they wait over for that big meal. So I can't tell them, man, I'm going to have to try to push back or something because they look forward to having that big meal. And it's hard to push back, Connie, when there's these little ladies are saying you got to eat their pies. And they're putting it on your plate for them. But anyway, you're ready to start the meeting. Everybody's happy. And then the song leader gets up and the first song he sings, "In the land of fadeless day lies the city foursquare." That might be all right at somebody's funeral, but not the first day of the week for the meeting. No. Appropriate songs. Don't we think about before the Lord's Supper, we want to have a song that... Now, think about this. Singing is a part of the worship, but it's also, it transitions us from one act to another, doesn't it? Right? It transitions from one act to another. So, if I'm going to be speaking on the love of God, most likely Jonathan's going to sing what? The love of God. Or God is love, something that goes along with that. When you think about the opening of the service, you think about a song of praise. We praise thee, O God, O worship the King. Our God is alive. The Lord is in His holy temple. All right, those are songs that you think about the beginning of the worship. All right? And a proper invitation in. So you want a song leader who has some sense of that. Okay? But you also want a congregation that understands the importance of singing. Yeah. And that everybody gets to be a participant. We don't come in New Testament worship to listen to a rogue choir. As much as I enjoy hearing that, in New Testament worship, and I can appreciate the training into that, in New Testament worship, everybody gets to sing. Now, God takes pleasure in that. Oh, sure, I understand that maybe to our ears, that doesn't sound as appealing as listening to trained voices, but first of all, we're trying to please God. And God wants to hear each one of us sing. And I'll tell you, we've talked a lot about this building, about some shortcomings. One, in my judgment, the acoustics aren't as good as I'd like for them to be. But I'll tell you, if everybody would sing like he or she's supposed to sing, the roof would come off. Okay, regardless of those acoustics. But singing's not mumbling. And singing is certainly not when someone has his mouth closed. And oh, I think about the God of heaven who I'm worshiping, who knows whether I'm singing or not, and if I'm singing from the heart. Okay. Well, we could go on throughout the worship assembly and talk about the Lord's Supper and what the focusing of our minds upon the Lord's Supper and the getting involved in the sermon and following the lead of the preacher, teacher in that Bible class period or that sermon period of the worship. And then think about this giving. That's something you prepare ahead of time, right? And so you know ahead of time, I'm going to give and give liberally, sacrificially for the work of the church. All of that goes together to demonstrate proper worship. Not just getting the acts of worship right, but having your heart involved in that too. Does that make sense? Okay.